Good afternoon. Welcome to our History for Lunch, the second History for Lunch for the month of September. It's hard to believe we're already halfway through September. But to get us started, I will let you know that our next History for Lunch will be October the 2nd. We'll have Dr. David Moore from Warren Wilson College who will discuss the Spanish colonial trail here in North Carolina. It's the Berry site. He's been an archaeologist on that site for over 25 years, and he will discuss the finds from that particular site. But today we welcome native to Elizabeth City, Chris Meekins. We welcome him back home. He's going to be talking about the North Carolina troops, the 1861-1865, a roster, the ongoing project to identify service. Chris knows that this is his home, and he is more than welcome back home anytime that we can have him back in Eastern North Carolina. So we're going to get ready to get started, and we will share your... And can everybody see? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Laura. Adjust that. There we go, so you can see me. Always a pleasure to come back to Elizabeth City Museum of the Albemarle. They've been great friends over my professional career, having me speak many times, probably more times than I should have. But it's nice to come back home and to reacquaint myself with the hometown. Elizabeth City is growing and changing in many different ways. I'm a Riverside rat. I grew up what we call the Cabbage Patch across Charles Creek over here on Bartlett Avenue. I like to say I'm an original Cabbage Patch Kid because so for 19 years as a public historian, I was a research and reference archivist for the state of North Carolina. And then I was fortunate enough to land, I think what is my dream job is helping manage the roster project. My co-editor, Carly Beeler, and I are currently working on the U.S. Navy, and I'll get to that towards the end, but just as a way of introducing myself and what I'm doing. So I was charged with dismantling and packing up the old office of the roster project, and in doing that, I realized there was, at least to me, I hope to you, an interesting sort of history of the project over time and the attempts at North Carolina to document her service in the Civil War. So we'll jump right into that. The state of North Carolina's ongoing efforts to document the service of American Civil War spans a time frame that begins during the war itself and continues to the present day. During those 163 years and counting, there have been 4 efforts by the state to document service in that war. The Roll of Honor, as you see up here, was state authorized. John Wheeler Moore's roster from 1881-1883 was also state authorized. Walter Clark's regiments during the late 1800s was authorized by the Confederate veterans, but then paid for by the state of North Carolina. And then lastly, this current project, North Carolina Troops, 1861-1865, a roster, has also been state authorized. Each stab at constructing the service records of the men of the state during the war, after the first one, built upon the previous efforts, trying to record all of the service in the state with differing levels of accuracy over time. North Carolina's Roll of Honor was created when Robert L. Beall, a House of Commons representative from Davidson County, introduced a series of resolutions in December of 1862 that provided thanks to the ladies of the state for sending goods to soldiers and called for providing for a Roll of Honor. Now, done any research, if you looked at any newspapers from 61 and 62, you'll see ladies' aid societies who are knitting socks, putting together blankets, and sending those care packages to the locally recruited company or regiment. And then the officer, the captain of that regiment, would send a letter back to the local newspaper thanking the ladies of Pasquotank County for the socks that they sent us, et cetera, and so on. So that's what they're talking about when they mention sending goods to soldiers. Bill likely drew upon a similar resolution by the Alabama legislature passed a month earlier and also from the Confederate Congress's Act of October 13th, 1862. Bill's resolution echoed the Alabama's Act's language by authorizing the governor of the state to create a record, the Roll of Honor, to preserve the names of soldiers who distinguished themselves in the defense of their country. Introduced on the 6th of December 6th, the resolution quickly received a second and third reading in the House and was passed on December 8th, readmitted as House bill on December 8th. It was sent to the Senate on December 11th, becoming the Senate Bill 78, House Bill 125, and then received its first reading there. On December 17th, the Senate took up the bill and received a second and third reading, and the bill became law and was ordered to be enrolled. In addition to recording the men who died and distinguished themselves, the bill also allowed the governor to include the names of noble women who distinguished themselves if he thinks it expedient. It does not appear that Governor Vance thought they were expedient, for there are no women recorded in the Roll of Honor. So although the legislature acted quickly in passing the resolution in just 9 days, implementation of the bill and the creation of a Roll of Honor took a little while longer. By early April of 1863, newspapers across North Carolina began publishing the act so that the public would be aware of it. William Woods Holden, who's our guy over there in the corner, if I can get to him or not. That's William Woods Holden, who will become governor of North Carolina at some point, but currently in the 1860s, he is a newspaper editor of the Raleigh Standard, suggested that they expand the Roll of Honor to include those individuals who were helping the larger community by providing goods at a reasonable or low-cost rate. Holden printed the names of several merchants and farmers who were doing exactly that. You got to remember at the time there were bread riots in March of 1863 in Salisbury, and then again in April of 1863 in Richmond, Virginia, where the citizens were reacting to the rising price of commodities and the scarcity of commodities. By the end of April of 1863, other newspapers in North Carolina engaged Holden's idea and began suggesting local people to be included in a Roll of Honor. One newspaper, however, I love newspaper guys, suggested there should be a Roll of Infamy, listing of those people who exploited the markets for their own gains, the speculators, those people who were jacking the prices up on the goods. Holden dismissed the idea as impractical because he said, I have heard of so many instances of a kindred nature, it would be impossible to document all of them. Incidents of abuse were reported from the theater of war, such as outrageous shipping charges to men on the front when they received their packages from home. Occasionally, newspapers also received a request to put a man on the Roll of Honor who had died in action. For instance, in June of 1863, such a request was made for Corporal James Belvin, who died while holding Company I, 1st Regiment of North Carolina Troops' colors at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And it wasn't until October of 1863 that the official Adjutant General's Roll of Honor was organized. Almost a year. On September 14th, 1863, Adjutant General R.C. Gatlin issued Special Orders number 51, assigning Captain James Foote as the office of Assistant Adjutant General to, quote, prepare a Roll of Honor for the soldiers of North Carolina, per resolution of the General Assembly. Foote was to proceed immediately to the discharge of said duty. It is not entirely clear where Foote was supposed to garner that information for the individuals who were to be included in the roll. Evidently, the military units, regiments, and battalions, etc., were to submit forms to the North Carolina Adjutant General that included such information. Blank forms were created and sent out to the various commands to be filled out and returned. Apparently, Foote had no sooner begun collecting the information than the project was forced to be abandoned. The last regiment included in the Roll of Honor volumes was the 61st North Carolina. Wartime documentation would take you through the 70th Regiment, and then after that, after the post-war, they went into the hundreds when they were adding militia and home guard regiments. But wartime, say the 70th. So there were at least 10 regiments or so that were not included. Those that were formed after January of 1864 were not included, suggesting that the project may have been halted before receiving any information from those late forming regiments. However, the Roll of Honor did include information about deaths from as late as October of 1864. And Foote's office kept a scrapbook that included newspaper clippings and battle casualties, obituaries, and like stories that were dated, some of them as late as February of 1865. Yes, I looked through all of that stuff. Raleigh was captured by United States forces in mid-March of 1865. So the internal evidence of the Roll of Honor suggests that it was overtaken by the war itself before it could be completed. Captain Foote managed to compile and make entries for a total of 9 volumes. They contain a brief unit history, a sketch at the start of each section, name of a soldier, the rank, the county of enlistment, the date of enlistment, the age, if they were a volunteer or a conscript, and their date of death. And you can see all that information reflected here. The series is limited by how well each unit submitted the requested forms, by newspaper coverage of events. For instance, today is the day after Old Trap was attacked in 1862 by guerrillas. Old Trap was a Union-based Company D in Camden County. They were here recruiting for new members of Company D. And because of Antietam, Sharpsburg in the newspapers, there's almost no newspaper coverage of the action over in Camden County, local as it was. So newspapers could be spotty. By the truncated time to accomplish acquiring and organizing the information. So although authorized in December of 1862, Foote was not assigned the duty until September of 1863, and work stopped by the time that Raleigh was occupied in March of 1865, at best 18 months of compiling this document. The resolution of the General Assembly required that the Roll of Honor be prepared, but it did not ask that it be printed. The 9 volumes in the scrapbook were, until the creation of the State Archives in 1903, available for viewing at the State Library, and both items were transferred to the State Archives and returned to the Creating Agency series of the Adjutant General's office, where if you go today, you can see those unpublished volumes and scrapbooks at the State Archives. Now, I think I mentioned 4 projects at the front. Well, it turns out that, a little surprise, there was a 5th project that the Roll of Honor and that the roster project historians didn't uncover, but because, like I said, I like to read newspapers, I found this little project. Newspapers accounts from 1881, so I will get to Moore's roster, which was suggested in 1881. That's why these newspaper guys get into it. Another roster completed during the Civil War. As newspaper editors debated the proposal for a new roster, they argued about the existence of a published roster, something that other than that Roll of Honor. In 1881, proposal was for John Wheeler Moore to craft a roster, and the newspaper editors weighed in on that project about Moore, but also about this other published roster. William Henry Bernard, the influential editor of the Wilmington Star, applauded the prospect of having a record of the state's service in the war, but Moore said he wouldn't have. Moore would not have much to do, as the roster has already been prepared and printed. He asserted that Governor Vance had attended to that during the war. Crosstown editor in Wilmington, Joshua James of the Wilmington Review, thought that Bernard was wrong. The roster prepared by Governor Vance during the war, a copy of which is in our possession, is a roster of the field and company officers, but not the non-commissioned officers and privates. James questioned Bernard's claim that the work was already done. In this, I believe he is mistaken, said James. He went on to say that it would be a major undertaking to construct such a roster. So not to be outdone, and I'm sorry you can't see Randolph Shotwell. You see my head instead, sorry. Not to be outdone by their colleagues, Raleigh editors weighed in on the ongoing debate over the existence of a roster project during the war. Randolph A. Shotwell of the influential Farmer and Mechanic newspaper thought that Brother James was slightly in error. Shotwell affirmed that there was indeed a Roll of Honor, including a sketch of a regiment and the names of the men, as we saw. He stated, however, it was created by Major James Foote and is now in the library, which is what we also found out. Samuel Court Ash, the crosstown newspaper of the News and Observer, still in print today, had the final say in the back and forth argument in the news. In our recollection is correct, wrote Ash. Both of them are partly right. Ash verified that the Roll of Honor, never published, was in the holdings of the state library, but he also said that there was a roster of officers printed, and we, the royal we have one. Not only did these editors mention a wartime roster, but two of them indicated they actually have possessions in their possession copies of this roster. And this roster has never before been identified by the project. And I just sort of, what is this thing? So thank goodness for Google. I Googled the Register of Officers in North Carolina, and this came up. It happens there was something here to that. The Adjutant General's Office published a register of officers for the North Carolina militia. It lists only officers. No enlisted men or non-commissioned officers were included. And Duke University has a digital copy of it. So if you Google this at home, you can see Duke's digital version. The outline that I have up there are actually the holdings at the North Carolina collection in the Wilson Library at UNC. And you can see that there are 4 different volumes published. I wrote to UNC and I asked them if they could send me at least like the front matter of the book, because I was just curious, where did this come from? They replied that when they checked it out, that these were all photocopies from some other document, and they don't know, there was no front matter. So what I think happened was that the Adjutant General gave an annual report to the General Assembly, and that was published as part of the governor's report to the General Assembly on all the different branches of state government. And I think that's what they had in their possession in their copy, but it's hard to really know. It's a guessing game. So there was something. There were no further statewide rosters created during or immediately after the war. There was, however, a publication from the United States government, The War of the Rebellion. On June 23rd, 1874, U.S. Congress gave an appropriation so that the Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln at the time, could begin the publication of the official records of the War of the Rebellion. 6 years later, Congress passed an act to provide for the printing and the binding of any of the materials that were ready for publication. That same year, in 1880, volumes 1 and 2 of the series were printed, bound, and distributed. Both contain content about North Carolina. The publication of these 2 volumes of the series may have been the inspiration for the call in 1881 of North Carolina to craft a roster of her soldiers. Newspaper William Henry Bernard, who we had met earlier, brought up the ongoing struggle over the narrative of North Carolina during the war. Thus far, our state has not received even-handed justice as to the war, he wrote. The state should gather up the records of the war to present a correct narrative of North Carolina's service. Bernard cited, as but one example, the Battle of Gettysburg. We do not believe, he wrote, that there are 5 men beyond the limits of our own state who know precisely what part North Carolina soldiers bore in that tremendous fight. Almost from the day after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Virginia newspapers were full of the glory of the Virginia soldiers, to the lamenting the participation of North Carolina soldiers. So it was ongoing from the war. The record was misrepresented and generally devalued, especially by other former Confederate states, and in particular Virginia. We don't know why Virginia had it enforced, but they did. Ooh, that's the war rebellion. Okay. Regardless of that motivation, on January 25th, 1881, the Honorable William T. Dortch of Wayne County introduced Senate Resolution 277, an act to provide a roster of North Carolina troops, and placed copies of it in the state library. So create it and print it. The resolution was sent to the Committee on the State Library for review. 10 days later, that resolution emerged with new language, according to the newspaper. I could never figure out what the old language was. It then had a second and third reading in the Senate and was ordered to be engrossed and became law on February 7th. No, I'm sorry, engrossed. And then the next day it was sent back to the House to receive the readings there, where it was adopted and became law on February 10th. The authorization of a roster was made law in a mere 16 days after it was first proposed. I also like to point out that Mr. Dortch, with all of his accomplishments on his gravestone, doesn't mention that he was the one that had a hand in the creation of the roster project. I forgive him for that. But I just want to know he needed to put that on his headstone. The reworded resolution ordered the state library trustees, Governor Thomas Jordan Jarvis, a relative, State Superintendent of Public Instruction John C. Scarborough, Secretary of State William Lawrence Saunders, to play a role in the creation, publication, and distribution of the new roster. Now, all three of these men had been Confederate soldiers. Jarvis, I think, lost the use of an arm. Sanders at this time was the head of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. Details of a resolution included information on who should bear the cost of printing, coordinating the distribution, which officials should receive copies, and who would be allowed to sell additional copies of this publication. The most important item in the agenda, however, was that the group was empowered and instructed to hire John Wheeler Moore to complete the work. Now, John Wheeler Moore's star was on the rise by 1881. By birth, he was a nephew of the historian John H. Wheeler, who had done a North Carolina history, I believe, in the 1830s or 40s. After serving in the Civil War, Moore turned to writing snippets of history. He wrote the School History of North Carolina, which was intended as a book for school children. That likely placed him in contact with Superintendent Scarborough. Next, Moore had a serial publications, The Sketches of Hertford County, which is where he was living, that ran from 1877 to 1878 in the Murfreesboro newspaper. By 1880, he had taken that serial and expanded it and made it a reference history of the state of North Carolina in general. It is little wonder then that when the state of North Carolina's General Assembly decided that they were going to publish a roster, they would turn to Moore to craft it. Now, by law, Moore has been ordered to be hired to craft that. The state library trustees met on March 17th, 1861, to consider legislation authorizing the hiring of Moore. They reached out and they asked Moore to give them a proposal to consider, and he replied the next day. Moore's proposal expanded the legislative authority, notably by suggesting that the roster include the North Carolina units, as you can highlight it in blue, of the United States forces. No one had mentioned that before. Moore advocated for a clerk or maybe two, to assist him with the project. Interestingly enough, he chose to gently correct the library trustees' contact letter. Secretary of State Saunders mentioned that the resolution adopted by the General Assembly, and Moore corrected him and replied, no, that was an act, which is just astounding. It probably wasn't a good idea to correct your future employer, right? I wouldn't think it would have been. Newspapers reported that Moore began working on the roster by March 27th. Now, it must have been preliminary research, as the library trustees had not approved his proposal yet. On the last day of March of 1881, Moore published an appeal in the newspapers asking that people send in their diaries, their reminiscences, their muster rolls, regimental logs, anything related to the war that would help him. And then he guaranteed it would all be returned promptly once used. Moore was proceeding based on that assumption that the legislature had authorized his hire. I mean, it was an act of law. The library trustees, led by Saunders, met yet again on April 30th to discuss the scope of the project. Even though it was obvious that Moore was already at work identifying sources and otherwise working on the project, the trustees had not signed off on his proposal yet. They asked for and received a more detailed proposal from Moore, who did his best to outline the massive undertaking, including referencing the type of font and half font that would be used in the volume, because that's how much space would be taken up, which would mean that's how many pages they needed to buy. So, I mean, Moore was meticulous in what he wrote down. Moore was finding and reported that the bulk of the materials he needed to review, however, were housed in Washington, D.C. as part of the Record of War Office that was predating the War of Rebellion series. Moore laid out his expenses and requested, again, 2 competent clerks to assist him. The trustees received his proposal and adjourned, promising to review it at their next meeting in May. So here he is working along. Finally, at that meeting in May, the trustees decided that Moore's proposal exceeded the authority set out in the original resolution. They didn't like the part about the federal units. Rather than have an in-depth unit history, which would consume time and space and therefore money, they wanted a pared-down proposal with minimal information about the regimental unit, a list of men without any additional service, nor did they want any mention of the United States forces. They invited Moore to the May meeting to work out the details of the project together in person. And not only did the trustees narrow the scope of the project, but they lowballed Moore's salary request to accomplish the task. They did, however, agree to pay him for the 2 months of work that he'd already done. And both parties now in agreement, Moore could start in earnest on the roster project. So Moore continued to encounter problems with the project. He created blank forms and sent those out, requesting that the forms be returned. By the end of August of 1881, newspapers were reporting that none of those, by and large, had been returned. Moore had to divide his time between working with the records in Raleigh and working with those held in the record office in Washington. So by necessity, the project became a family affair. Moore appointed his wife, Julia Wheeler Moore, the first woman on the roster project, to transcribe the roll of honor and the other materials in Raleigh for inclusion in the roster. She spent more than 12 months on the task, and it was so laborious that eventually their son, Philip, joined her in transcribing the records in Raleigh. Moore then received permission to access the records in Washington, D.C., literally had to write and request permission to view these closed records, which again, Robert Todd Lincoln granted him permission to do. He could not find anyone to go through the records, so once again, he turned to family. His Wheeler family relatives were living in D.C., so he hired his daughter, Julia Moore, to go live with them and work on the Raleigh-based records. By September of 1861, she was at her uncle's family and spent 15 months working in those records. Now, her cousin, also a Julia, I got three Julias I'm dealing with, helped her from time to time for about a total of 4 months of labor. Money was a constant problem. The trustees, like I said, had lowballed the project and agreed to pay out piecemeal by work that was produced as well as that monthly salary. Moore found himself constantly writing them and asking to cover expenses of his assistants, and they were not covered in the original monthly salary agreement. And although the trustees usually agreed to his request, they never agreed to the amount that he requested, but instead continued to offer him less payment than what he asked for or needed. Even so, Moore's focus on the work paid off. By November of 1881, only 8 months from his initial assessment of the records, Moore reported he had already was at the printer with the first volume. By mid-February of 1882, material for volume 1 was being typeset. By March, the first printed volume was delivered to Moore and the library trustees. By the end of 1882, all 3 of the 4 volumes that were published were finished, and then all 4 were completed and distributed to the library by May of 1883. Moore completed his project in a total of 29 months. We're at 63 years right now in the current roster project. It's amazing that he got this out in a little over 2.5 or 2 1/3 years. So what Moore didn't address was that narrative, right? But there was a man named John A. Sloan who started writing a book, War Between the States, North Carolina in the War Between the States, as a serial. And he started that in January of 1883, just as this was Moore's project was ending. And for the next couple of years, Sloan tried to get this book in print. And he would do 100 pages by subscription. He got through like the first 200 pages, first 2 chapters. And then it all fell apart because nobody was subscribing and he wasn't getting any money. He went ahead and finished the book himself. He was also trying to land a political office that would, in the state or federal government that would pay him while he worked on this book. That none of that came to fruition. So he became very bitter about then Senator Vance manipulating him. In mid 1885, he found a printer in Baltimore who would print it. And he told everybody in the newspapers it was coming out in mid-November. And then on November 7th, he disappeared. Absolutely and completely disappeared. They traced him first to a local haberdashery where he ordered the most expensive coat. And while he was standing for that suit and coat, said the most incomprehensible things. They couldn't even figure if he was speaking English. He was just so discombobulated is the best word. He didn't pay for the coat, um, and he left. At the same time, he published a pamphlet about Senator Vance that was not very nice. Um, when the family in Greensboro got a copy of it, an advance copy, they burned it and they went to the printer and had the printer destroy all the rest of it. So I don't, it's called the Ichabod pamphlet. I don't know what he said about Vance, but it wasn't very nice. And it scared his family so bad, they wanted it all gone. And then he disappeared. And a lot of people thought Vance might have had a hand in that disappearance. For 2 months, nobody could find him. Then they found his body in a creek just north of Baltimore of apparent suicide, is what they called it. His book, however, lived on. It was finished, except for being printed. The state got interested in it only after his death. And through 1888, there were efforts to edit and get this thing published because he was going to tell, North Carolina's role in the war between the states. My last reference for it, 1890, says whatever happened to Sloan's book. So I'm still looking for it. We'll see if we can find it. But that's sort of outside the roster project, but it has to do with that narrative. Moore's roster, as it became known, filled a niche of documenting the men who served, but it did not satisfy that unit history niche. Nor did Moore dispel any of those perceived slights of North Carolina's honor, such as the overlooked role of North Carolinians in the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederate Veterans Association annual meeting in Raleigh in October of 1894 passed a resolution to have a history of each regiment and organization from North Carolina which served in the Confederate Army, prepared by a member of that unit, and that Walter Clark be the one to contact prospective historians and serve as the editor of the whole project. In addition, the veterans called on the legislature to fund the printing of the resulting books. Clark was appointed the committee chair to secure regimental histories. He began at once contacting possible historians. He noted that his task was already difficult because so many who might have written those unit histories had passed away. It was at this point almost 30 years since the end of the war. The process for Clark to identify historians for a regiment, contact those men, get someone to commit to writing up a history, and then have the newspapers print those histories so that anyone who served in the unit could read it, send in corrections or comments to Moore, and then hopefully improve on Clark and hopefully improve upon that narrative. Clark sent out 500 handwritten letters of inquiry to historians or prospective historians, and finally settled on some 80 of those. And this is an example. You see the first one I could find in January of 1895, a unit history printed in a newspaper. And then on the other side is a list of all the men who were historians that agreed to write. The draft of the regimental histories began appearing in newspapers in early 1895. The first one appeared in January, and several papers across the state then shared a reprint of that article, again, so that everyone who might have served in that unit would have a chance to see it and make comment upon it. That process was repeated, and the papers from this time period are full of those unit histories. Clark also thought that photographs of the officers from the time of the war would make a good addition to the project. That required engraving the image, which was an expensive proposition in the late 1800s. Fortunately, he found a northern publisher with southern roots who agreed to take on the expense of the engraving. Some family members of those whose pictures were engraved also helped defray the cost of that process. Clark secured a few maps to supplement the series, and every aspect of the project was moving forward at a rapid speed when it suddenly came to a stop. Clark continued to gather the histories, and newspapers continued to print them, but they hit the brick wall of not having any money to print the series itself. And they were dependent upon the General Assembly. And when they asked in 1895 and 1897, the General Assembly said no. And because there was no funding, it sort of got the historians a sense of lack of urgency, like this project will never happen. So they didn't write their histories, which became a problem when some of those historians began also dying. Finally, in 1899, the General Assembly, persuaded by a member who was also one of the historians of the regimental histories, passed an act to fund the publication of the entire series. Clark immediately filled any of those historian openings, and all of that work was returned to him by the spring of 1900. Then the books ran into delays at the state printer. I think the printer just didn't want to do it. Finally, in 1901, the General Assembly stepped in again with a law authorizing and ensuring that the printer would have all these done in a timely manner. By the end of 1901, 5 volumes had been finished and published. In all, it was a little over 7 years to complete the series. So we went from 2 1/3 years to 7 years, and the first one in the war itself. So everyone's efforts, it takes a little more time. Clark's regiments, as the 5 volume set became known, ended the efforts to document the service of North Carolinians during the Civil War. In the 40 years since the start of the war, veterans had delivered 4 efforts that sought to illustrate that service. North Carolina formed a historical commission in 1901, and one of its earliest endeavors was to produce essays on the various disputed laurels of North Carolina's record in the Great War of 1861-65. Those essays addressed the ongoing Gettysburg picket charge narrative, claims of furthest to the front at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, the first battle casualty of the war, and who fired the last shots at Appomattox Courthouse. You know, just the little things in the war. The editor stated that these essays were, these claims, they said, are not made as a matter of boast. They are merely a statement of historical facts. You often hear these items called the rebel boast or North Carolina's rebel boast, and here the editors are directing that, saying, no, we're just merely stating what these men actually accomplished. We're not boasting on them. In 1905, these essays were followed up by monuments that were placed in locations across Virginia. So North Carolina went to Virginia and placed a series of monuments. Virginia fought them on that. They didn't want this. That's the North Carolina monument at Appomattox on the far side. They called it a sarcophagus. And Virginia fought tooth and nail against it. And it wasn't until a New Jersey group put a monument up at New Bern, and North Carolina welcomed them in 1905 to do that, that Virginia finally said, okay, you know, you've shamed us enough. We'll let you put your monument up. So Houston Gwynn Jones on the far right, and only if you were in his Sunday school class could you call him Houston. Otherwise, everyone knew him as H.G. Jones. He was a native North Carolinian who used the GI Bill to earn a PhD in history from Duke University in June of 1965. Prior to finishing his studies at Duke, however, he became the state archivist of North Carolina in 1956. Among his many accomplishments, he was the first to previously identify an unattributed diary as belonging to the Confederate spy Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who perished in the coastal waters of North Carolina in 1864. So he always had an interest in the Civil War. And he began to notice, though, that Moore's roster and Clark's regiments were not adequate in answering patrons' questions about their ancestors when they wrote to or came to the state archives. Jones saw a need for a new roster, and he began looking for a way to make that happen. The centennial of the Civil War was only 5 years away at this point. In 1959, anticipating that major interest in the 100th anniversary of the American Civil War, the North Carolina legislature created an act of law, the North Carolina Confederate Centennial Commission. The commission was to coordinate and plan state and local events and participate in national events when possible. Norman C. Larson, closest to me, was selected as the executive secretary of that commission, and Colonel Hugh Dortch, who was the grandson of William Dortch, who introduced Moore's roster, was named chairman of that commission. By 1960, Larson had set up a publications committee. In consultation with Dortch and Jones, invited the respected professors of academia at that time, notable independent historians, and several prominent newspaper editors, and a few other citizens. The committee members hailed from all corners of the state. The only person to decline was Hugh Leffler, a professor at UNC, who was elderly at the time and said he cited too much work, poor health, and the doctor's orders to slow down. So other than that, everyone they asked agreed to serve. Herbert O'Keefe, who was a newspaper editor, called the committee together. for their first meeting on December 1st, 1960, when they would begin planning the publication projects for the North Carolina Confederate Centennial Commission. It's a long buildup, but I'm getting there. From the start, the Publications Committee debated whether they should just update Clark's regiments, reprint them without updating them at all, or go with a new publication of a regimental history. One committee member thought the expense would make that whole venture just too impractical. But Chairman O'Keefe thought the committee should consider the publication of a work devoted to an outstanding North Carolina regiment. And then one member suggested that perhaps the 26th North Carolina would be a fine project along those lines. The committee then made the following recommendation: that a commission undertake the publication of a scholarly volume for public consumption to show North Carolina's participation in the Civil War. Committee member Dr. Woody thought that was a good recommendation if the right man could be gotten for the work. Two members of the committee would go on to publish volumes in the Centennial Commission. Glenn Tucker, a renowned historian, published a children's book through our agency called Front Rank, which, if you get Front Rank, it addresses Gettysburg, Chickamauga, all the things I talked about earlier. That book in a child's format. Then Richard Yopes, staff researcher with the state archives, published The Bloody Sixth, which is an account of the 6th Regiment in North Carolina. It has a narrative and it has a roster in it, and therefore the roster project actually claims that this is the first volume in the roster project. I apologize for some of the fuzziness of the photos. I lost this entire presentation when a flash drive died on me, and I had to recreate it out of the printed out copy. So I apologize for that. The search for the right man led the project to lead the project did not take very long. One committee member put forward the name of George Gelbach, a Duke graduate who had done his thesis work on Gettysburg. Gelbach had taught at the Fort Union Military Academy in Virginia and was currently living at the time of the request in Edenton, semi-retired. Instead, he opted to serve on the group organizing the Bentonville Battlefield Historic Site, which was another project of the North Carolina Confederate Centennial Commission. Jones then suggested Lewis Mannering for the roster project position. Mannering and Jones were classmates at Duke University, and both would receive their degrees in June of 1965. Jones knew that Mannering was currently working as a co-editor on the forthcoming The Wartime Letters of Robert E. Lee. Larson immediately had Mannering in for an interview, and by the end of 1960, offered him the position. Mannering accepted the offer and thus became the first editor of the current roster project. He immediately hired his wife, Joanne, and so again, the first roster staff was a man and a woman. So the work began surveying the records held in the National Archives in D.C. Lewis and Joanne, seen here, had some office space allotted to them at National Archives, which just seems incredible to me, while Lewis continued his studies at Duke. The roster project took its organization from the arrangement of the compiled service records. The Mannerings simply worked the records as they were already presented to them. The first roster volume is about artillery because that's how the records were arranged in the National Archives. Here we can see them working on the cavalry records. If you can see that 2nd North Carolina Cavalry, and the cavalryman's name on the box is Barnes. Now today, just to show you the difference, today I can jump on Fold 3 and I can look at those same records, and I can, anywhere that I can connect to the internet, I can do this at home, I can do this office, I could do this, in the Hampton Inn here in Elizabeth City, and I can look at, that's Edwin Barnes in the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry, which is the 19th North Carolina State Troops. So I get to see the same thing that they do. Once it was understood that the Centennial Commission was producing this roster, they received a steady stream of inquiries, continuing to today, as to when the roster would be available and if they could check on an ancestor. In this example from March of 1963, you can see two themes that would repeat through the life of the project. One is overstating how quickly the series would be completed, and the second is building a mailing list, which they maintained until 2014. Here, the administrative assistant, Carolyn Myers, tells the Inquirer that the first volume on cavalry would be ready at the end of 1963. Well, wrong on both accounts. The first volume was artillery, as I mentioned earlier, and it did not come out until 1966. She also states that the entire roster would be finished by 1965 or 6. And we know that's not the case. The editors of the project continue to oversell how quickly it would be finished and undersell how many volumes it would take to be completed over the course of the project. I think that's a function of budget. If you go to the General Assembly and you ask for a biennial budget, you'd like to say, give me 2 more years of salary, I'll be finished with this project. And then in 2 years, we go, well, we didn't quite meet that, but give me 2 more years of salary, I'll be finished with this project. So I think that's why you see that happening. Being in Washington, D.C. in the early 1960s presented some challenges. The archives is located near the north end of the National Mall, that open expanse of land that runs from the Capitol building on the north end, past the Washington Monument, past the reflecting pool, and all the way to the Lincoln Memorial on the south end. In this letter, Mannering tells Larson that the team did not work at the archives on August 28th. They did not even venture into town. Well, why? On August 28th, 1963, the mall was a little crowded as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So they didn't, the roster people said, we're not even going to try to get, there's just no use. Mannering also mentions that there are tapes that they are using, and these are tapes from a dictaphone. Evidently, Lewis would read the compiled service records and had that recorded on the dictaphone and then would send that to a typist who would then type out from the tape what he had read into it. Eventually, the staff in Raleigh required a matching dictaphone so that he could read the stuff and send it to them and they could type it out in Raleigh. And when I cleaned out the office last year in 2023, I found both all the original tapes and the dictaphone. The roster project was known for not throwing anything away that they ever bought with government money. So as you can see here, here's Lou dedicating a book to and signing it to Norman Lawson, and it's July 26th. It is the first book that came out. That's how long it took. Volume 1 was published in 1966. The Centennial Commission ended in 1965. Move it forward in time a little bit. The most recent volume of the roster series was published in February of 2024. That's this year. Volume 22 focuses on naval service, including information about sailors, Marines, and the Charlotte Navy Yard. Yes, there was a Navy Yard in Charlotte where there is no water. This volume is a turning point in the series. We will continue and, as had been planned in 1960, turn the focus on the service of those men in the United States forces. The new series will be Series 2, and Volume 1 will start with the United States Navy. From there, Series 2 will document the African American regiments and the white regiments from Eastern and Western North Carolina. By creating a Series 2, it allows for a possible return to Series 1 to finish documenting Confederate service. There are units in other state troops like the 62nd Georgia, the 59th Virginia Cavalry, to name a few. And there are a few national units like the Confederate Engineering Corps and the Signal Corps that we hope to at some point return and get those done as well. We'll walk you through some of the editors, all of the editors. So Lewis and Joanne were worked on several volumes together. He compiled the service records and wrote the unit histories for volumes 1 to 3. He then took a job as the state archivist of Virginia, while his friend Jones was the state archivist of North Carolina, quite a power couple, I would say. In 1970, the project was firmly centered in Raleigh as part of the Historical Publications Division. They hired Weymouth T. Jordan, known as Hank, to lead the roster project. He took over compiling the service records and contracted with Mannering to continue to write the unit histories. And Lewis wrote the unit histories through volume 11, which was published in 1987, which was 26 years with the roster project. Like I said, Richard Yost was credited by Mannering as being part of that project, citing the Bloody Six as the first roster project. Now, I see you can't see Hank Jordan. It's a young Hank Jordan Weymouth T. Jordan, prior to becoming a roster project editor, served 2 years, actually prior to going to school, served 2 years in Army intelligence. And I think what he learned in Army intelligence was how to not have his photograph taken. So this is a photograph from, I want to say, about 1961 or two in a newspaper where his personal private library won a $100 award because it was the best Civil War library in the city or the state. And I want to say this is in Georgia, where his dad was a professor. That's the only picture I could find of him. And I think they made him have a picture because he won the money and they wanted to show it in the newspaper. There he is, a little better in that one. For a while, he worked alone as the editor of the series and compiled the service records and wrote the unit histories. Monahan's contract was not renewed largely because of budget restrictions. However, it must be noted that for several volumes prior to his release, Jordan had complained about the unit histories and the use of large block quotes within the narratives that Lewis turned in. From volume 12 onward, the narrative takes on a more academic format, less use of those large block quotes. Jordan is the one who spurred that innovation, and he continued writing those unit histories through volume 15. William Lang Baradell joined the staff and helped produce volume 13, published in 1993. He then took a position with the Colonial Papers Project of the Publications Department and is now retired and is somewhat of a, to use a bad term, lounge lizard. He sings the blues, I think. And anyway, so losing him slowed down the publication of volume 14. And during this time frame, Jordan also requested and received permission to work on several articles for the North Carolina Historical Review in 1995. These articles were outgrowth of research for the various roster units. And most importantly, he wrote and co-authored an article with Gerald Thomas that analyzed the Battle of Plymouth and sifted the evidence of a possible massacre of Black and white U.S. servicemen by Confederate forces in the aftermath of that fight. We've just recently dedicated or approved of, and we're going to have a state historical marker up about the Plymouth Massacre. Matthew Brown joined the roster team in 1998, and he produced the compiled service records for volumes 14 and 15, while Jordan continued to write the unit histories. When Jordan retired in 2004, the roster project hired Michael Coffey, PhD, to write the unit histories. Dr. Coffey was the first PhD in history on staff since Lewis left. Jordan had studied but not completed a doctorate, and Brown had a doctorate in law but not history. Jordan raised the unit histories bar after taking over from Mannering. Well, Coffey elevated that to a new height. The topics of volumes 16 through 22 are extremely difficult and more complicated than any of the previous unit histories. Coffey tackled Thomas's Legion, the junior and senior reserves, detailed men, miscellaneous battalions and companies, the general staff, generals, militia, and home guard. And each of those required a deep dive into describing the structure of those units. Coffey was more than equal to the task. In 2014, the Historical Publications branch merged with the research branch when an opportunity to be a researcher for all of North Carolina history arose and not just Civil War. In 2018, Dr. Coffey decided to pursue his interest in the state's history. He is also a native North Carolinian. For a short time, Dr. Troy Kickler joined the roster team and he worked with Matthew Brown. He joined in June of 2018. Brown left in the fall of 2019. No volumes were completed during this process, but volume 24, which had been started by Brown and Coffey, was almost finished. But I joined the roster project March 16, 2020. Now, you might recall that day as the day that everyone in state government was told to go home because of the COVID pandemic. So my first day in office, I literally got the keys to my office and I was told go home, where I spent the next year working from home. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Kickler took a position in the Colonial Papers Project, just as Baradell had done. In June of 2021, Katie Hatton joined the roster project as an editor. Together, Hatton and Meekins, myself, completed the current volume 22. and hadn't joined the Colonial Records Project. We keep losing people to the Colonial Records Project. But volume 22 came out this year. In February of 2023, a little over a year ago, well, a year and a half now, Carly Beeler joined the Roger Prosser team as a co-editor. Meekins and Beeler are currently finishing the service records of North Carolinians who joined the U.S. Navy, free and enslaved African Americans, white men who were loyal from the start or who became galvanized, which means they were in a prison camp and decided to get out of prison by taking an oath of allegiance and then enlisting in either the Army or the Navy. And then we have documentation of at least one American Indian, but I think there are a lot of free people of color from Bertie County who are probably American Indian that we don't have the actual documentation to stay at. The goal is to have this volume out in 2025. So I thank you for coming and listening to me go on about my precious project and its history. I hope to be cool one day, but I'll never be cool as Lawson is in his little pork pie and his thin tie with his black shoulder pads and everything, and his sunglasses. Anyway, you can contact Carly or myself. If you do whatever your favorite search engine is for North Carolina troops, 1861 to 65, you'll find our landing page where you can also then go to UNC press and purchase copies if you want. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take those and try to answer. I'm sorry?
What about prisoners?
So if during the first 21 books and in 22, if someone was taken prisoner, that's noted in their service record. And most likely it's noted sort of overarching in the narrative of the regiment. They fought at this place and these many men were captured. But yeah, that would be, we're not going to have a separate topic about them per se. We will address somewhat the whole system of prisons, North and South. Just because. So we've identified about 1,300 men to date in the current U.S. Navy project. About not quite 400 of those are white men, and out of those, 199 are men we can prove went from being a Confederate soldier to a U.S. Navy personnel. So we're going to cover that in the narrative, but it won't be a real deep dive on prisons. There are a lot of good books about prisons out there if you want to take a look at them. Heseltine and a couple others.
Is there a digital database now that in a searchable format that I could put in different search criteria? So I just wanted to know,
right,
every individual that was born in Pasquotank County who served,
right,
over all these years and all these volumes, could I digitally look that up and narrow it down?
You could not. There is no digital component. We are working with the Colonial Records Project. There's a digital online presence now. They're no longer publishing hardbound books per se, and most of their stuff is living online. And they've done some wonderful projects. Hatton is just fantastic with the stuff that she's done. And my understanding is currently Carly is working with them, and we will have a digital component of some of the narratives of the self-emancipating African-American men that will go up on that database. But we don't have a comprehensive database. So we have a couple of things that will simulate that are a little clunky, but you can figure it out. There is an index to all volumes, and I'm currently adding 21 and 22 to that and getting that ready. But I think there is an index online. It is a PDF, so it's searchable. You may find multiple hits for, particularly if your guy is John Jones and he served in different units. We did no effort into combining all that same name if it's the same man. So you might see 20 John Joneses listed And, some of those could be the same man. We didn't do that work for you. Also, previous roster editors had on index cards indicated, like Company K of the 12th North Carolina was from this county, mostly. And so I did make that a digital version. And again, that's a PDF. If you go to our landing page, you can see that and get a feel for by county what units served. Now, because artillery is pulled from many different places, cavalry is pulled from many different places, we don't really list all of those units on those cards because it's just impossible. And then remember, early on, they recruited from the county to replace men as the regiment had losses, but towards the ending of the war, they were just filling holes. And so you could serve in a unit from Western North Carolina just because they had more losses and they needed more men. So you won't always find a Pasquotank man in a regiment that was raised in Pasquotank County. So it's I would say comprehensive, but not exhaustive. And it will still require a lot of legwork on your part. And then the best thing to do is literally page by page through the roster series to see that kind
volumes are like $100 and some odd a piece.
Most of the volumes run to $50 to $55 a piece. And if you can find them still in print, I'm not sure what they're selling on the off-print market at the moment. And then you didn't hear this from me because we really haven't sanctioned it, but Family Search has for some reason scanned the first 19 volumes and they're all available digitally there. If you go on Family Search and look for the North Carolina Troops Roster series, you'll find them there. We've asked legal to look into that. I mean, they're still under copyright. I don't know why they did that, but yeah, it bad for us. It's wonderful for researchers who have that while it's still there. So I would seize the day. Anyone else? Way in the back. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Thompson. I'm wondering, will this project ever be completed? And if not, should we pay $250 a year? And will you have to request more money after 2025 when you're not complete?
Yeah, so budgets are biennial, and my salary is biennial. They'll go back and ask again. We haven't finished the project. Fortunately, I just spoke with the historical commissioners yesterday. They're excited about us moving on to United States forces and getting that done. So yeah, Mr. Thompson, we'll get that. We'll get there. Plus,
Thank you.
yes, sir. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Rosters compared to the Broadford publishing companies, Civil War troops.
Right. Broadfoot was the publisher who reprinted them for us. So those are our books. Yeah. I want to say about 2008, they did a reprint of all the volumes that were no longer in print, and they updated those volumes at that time with new information on the soldiers. And we continue to mark corrections as they come in. And at some point, hopefully we'll get back to that. And eventually, we hope to have a strong digital presence that you should be able to go into a database. There are things like Howard University work with the National Archives, and they have African-American soldiers and sailors in a database now. And there's a guy who's done some work like that for Hyde County. If you look for Hyde County Civil War stuff, his stuff is online through the Jim Webb project. So some people were doing those things. We haven't gotten there. And I think to our credit, I will say there are 22 volumes in print for Confederate service, and we wanted to make sure that the United States service was a printed volume. It may also have a digital component, but it would feel a little unbalanced if they only existed digitally and no printed, in my opinion. So, yes, ma'am.
I wrote to Broadfoot Publishing in Wilmington.
Right.
And they sent me a certificate with my relative And it's a pretty certificate. And it also, they sent me, copies of his records
Mhm.
when they, when they mustered in and mustered out and things like
Right.
that.
I think, for a long time, Broadfoot was a good friend of the Rockter project, but I think in the end, I think Broadfoot has no longer exists. I think they're, as a business, they're bankrupt. So you can't, the only place to purchase the Roster Troop volumes now is through UNC Press. Again, which you can find on our website.
Well, there is a satellite.
Or A Books or those kind of places at American Book Exchange. Yeah.
Prudent Library in Eatonton.
Right.
I'm from the Family Research Society here in the city.
Mhm.
So we gave all of our North Carolina books to the Prudent Library in Eatonton. And
Fantastic.
so, Stephen B. Weeks's books and
Oh, yeah.
Dr.
Dr. Weeks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say by and large that most of your, particularly your academic libraries in the region would probably have a copy of those books, but most of your public libraries too. It is, as quoted by someone else and not myself, it is an invaluable resource to historians and genealogists to try to find your ancestor in these things. So hopefully we'll continue to keep the level high for my $250 a year. So Mr. Thompson won't be disappointed.
That's okay.
Are there additional questions? Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris, for returning to Elizabeth City and providing us with this wonderful talk today. And thank you for inviting me to come back and actually.
All right. Well, I'm glad to know I haven't worn out my welcome yet. So thank you, everyone.